So welcome everyone. Welcome to Why Life, a living systems approach to organizational design. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Jeff Su. Jeff's a managing partner of Integrative, and he'll share more about his background and his story a little later on in the webinar. So today we have people from over 11 countries who signed up for the webinar. So we're super excited that this living systems approach to organizational design and really to how we design our collaborations as well is getting interest from places as diverse as Kenya to Singapore to Mexico. So super excited to be here. My name is Alex and I'm a project manager with Integrative. If you're not familiar with us, a little bit about us. We were founded in 2009. We've been working with organizations and networks around the world on organizational design and operational management and other consulting services since then. But in 2016, we began taking this regenerative approach to our work and our work with our clients, which is what we're excited to share more with you today about. And the development of this approach really began with an organization called the Savory Institute. They're best known for successful restoration of grasslands around the world through holistic land management. Some of you may be familiar with their work, but if not, they're definitely worth checking out if you're interested in regenerative agriculture and the impact on the environment. So we've been working with a number of organizations in a variety of fields, from architecture to nonprofits and manufacturing. And we have a community of practice with both practitioners and educators from all over the world. There's over 30 of us now, of which some of you here on the call are a part of. And so in addition to that, we offer things like online courses, organizational health assessments, and much more. And Jeff will be sharing a little bit more about that as well. So we've scheduled 60 minutes for today. We're going to save time for Q&A at the end, so please keep your questions coming in the chat, and I'll be sure that we get to those in the last part of the webinar. You'll have access to this recording and the slides after the webinar, probably at some point tomorrow, so you'll receive that by email in case you need to revisit the information or you want to rewatch or share with friends and colleagues. So please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. You could share your name, where you're calling in from. And we're really curious to know how this webinar, how the topic of this webinar, living systems and how we utilize them in organizational design relates to your work. And our hope is through these questions, we can create some more connectivity between folks on the call, because we at least all have that in common. So yeah, if you could go ahead and share your name, where you're from, and how this webinar relates to your work. And then keep an eye on the chat throughout today's webinar. We'll be posing some questions here and there while Jeff's presenting, just to kind of keep, dynamic conversation flowing. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jeff, to kick the webinar off.
Well, great. Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for attending today. It is really, really an honor to get to do this work, and I'm always quite amazed to see all these boxes of faces pop up on the internet from all over the world. And it's really great, the growing community and interest that we have all together in creating organizations that work for the planet and for people and for our communities. A little bit about how I came into this work. I started my career as an academic, as an ecologist, and moved into running different nonprofit organizations and networks and impact-oriented businesses focused on environmental and social issues. And most recently I'm incredibly honored to bring all of that experience into my work here within Rhythm to get to apply systems thinking and living systems thinking specifically to how we manage our organizations, whether they be nonprofits, for-profits, networks, governments, organizations. So really, again, thankful for you all to be here and happy to be a resource to you, and we will dive right in to the presentation. So just a little overview of what we'll talk about today. We will start talking about this idea of organizations being a machine and the machine metaphor that is so dominant of running organizations. And then introduce a very holistic and one of the only systems views of what life actually is and what living systems are. It's sort of a funny question to ask ourselves, what is life? It seems so intuitive at one hand and seems so obvious since we are living, but as we dig into it, it's actually hard to really put our fingers on exactly. And then we will introduce at the end in Rhythm's specific framework for designing organizations with living systems in mind. So what do we mean by this machine metaphor? Well, it is incredibly prevalent and dominant. It is really the dominant metaphor that we use to describe our human organizations. It is so prevalent, we use it in our language in so many ways we probably not even aware of on a day-to-day basis. We talk about working like a well-oiled machine, or referring to our own time as saying, I have the bandwidth or don't have the bandwidth for that. There are so many, as actually part of our online course, we had fun. We had a whole community of people contributing to all the different machine metaphors they use on a day-to-day basis. And it was great to see all the different examples that came out. Here are just two examples taken off. One is off the web. On the right is sort of a standard idea of the different departments working like gears in a machine where profits fall out the bottom end of the funnel. Or on the left, you have Georgia's talking about their whole state economy as an economic development engine or machine. And we all know, we actually refer to our own bodies as machines. Many of us, if you are 40 plus, grew up with watching this incredible National Geographic documentary on TV that talked about all the different systems of the body as a separate machine of some kind. And so the first question we want to ask, and feel free to put some responses into the chat as we talk through this question. But so what are the consequences, both intended and not intended, consequence of treating organizations as machines and therefore humans as parts of a machine? Well, if we look at the state of many different aspects of or indexes of how we are doing with this as our dominant metaphor for organizing our work, we see there's tremendous consequences on the planet. This is just one way of measuring it. This is the Living Planet Index, showing the decline in different vertebrate, freshwater, and terrestrial marine species since 1970, and we see a precipitous and very alarming decline. If we look at effects on people and productivity, this is some statistics from a recent Gallup poll about the nature of work and the engagement of work and how the satisfaction of work. And they found that 13% of people self-identify as engaged at work, that's only 13%, while 63% self-identify as not engaged, and 24% self-identify as actively disengaged, which means actually subverting the company or the organization they're working for in some way. And they put a dollar figure to this, which is useful to think about, that Gallup estimates that actively disengaged employees cost the US economy $450 billion to $550 billion in lost productivity per year. If we look at this question from an economic equality perspective, we see that we're now in a state of the world where we have individuals worth more in their individual wealth than entire countries. Just looking at the top, Bill Gates having more wealth than Myanmar, Ethiopia, Warren Buffett, Luxembourg, and you goes down the line here. And then from an equity perspective, we see all kinds of consequences, some intended and some unintended, where most of us still live in a country where, whether you look at infant mortality to life expectancy, to jobs, to education, to housing, race is still the #1 predictor of how well you will perform or how well you will do or how much access you have to these different aspects of society. And so in Rhythm, we see this as actually although these are alarming statistics, this in some ways is actually, well, I wouldn't say good news, but it's encouraging, because it means that if we have the metaphor wrong, that we actually have a solution to this. And for us, we call this a design issue, right? If we are designing our human organizations after a machine and it's coming to these consequences, then we need to look at other metaphors, other structures, other models of how we can design our organizations. And we look to, as many others are, to living systems designs. And why do we do that? And we'll get into some more detail, but on one level, intuitively, we are living systems. So on a very gut level or very straightforward level, it would make sense to design systems that we would thrive in as living organizations or as living beings. This is one way to think about this transition. This is adapted from Bill Reed, where we see a traditional or conventional mechanistic design for organizations on the left of this graph, moving to a state of, a sustainable organization, and moving to what is many of us are calling regenerative organizations and a living systems design. And the most important part of this figure to pay attention to is this middle column here, is that we actually, when we design to and manage systems, whether they be natural systems or human systems in this technical systems design, it actually requires more energy. It requires constant inputs. Versus if we really design with living systems in mind and in harmony with living systems, then we actually require less energy in our management and our operations of those systems. So agriculture, we have deep roots in the regenerative agriculture movement, and it's a great example of this. If we think of a traditional conventional agriculture system, constant inputs of fertilizer and pesticides and herbicides are needed to maintain that system. Yes, short-term yield is achieved, but there's a lot of energy required. Versus more regenerative systems is about designing systems that allow the underlying conditions and health of that system to arise without external inputs. And so the benefits of designing to a living system approach we see as three main benefits. One is this idea of realized potential, of revealing unrealized potential or hidden potential through an organizational design and practice. And we do this by focusing on the underlying or intrinsic health of the system. We see that by focusing on health the same way in an agriculture system, if we focus on soil health, we know we can grow whichever crop is meaningful in that context. Versus the reverse, which is if the soil is unhealthy, it doesn't matter which crop we are trying to plant in that soil, it will not thrive, it will not be healthy. And we try to think about what this means in terms of our personal and our organizational context. And the third aspect of this is the idea of designing not to prescriptive or recipes or prescriptive solutions or best practices, but actually providing flexible frameworks, designing with holistic and evolving structures that allow for informed decision-making that's both locally relevant and contextual. And we'll get into some more detail about what we mean by that. So, as I said, we have some deep roots connected to the Savory Institute. I came into this work and connected to many of the team members through the Savory Institute. And Alan Savory applied this holistic and living systems approach to managing grasslands. And the picture here, the transformation of this land you'll see here is using a holistic approach where there's no external inputs. So simply by simply managing this piece of land in a way that allowed for the underlying soil health to be nurtured and allowing what's already there to become emergent, we through holistic management, we transform this bare ground into this thriving grassland. And again, there's no fertilizer here, no external inputs. This is simply the seeds that were already there, the potential that's already there, being released, being emerged through a living systems approach to the management of this system. And further development here. And so we use this image, we keep this image in our minds on a daily basis to think about what does this look like for our human organizations? How do we transform the 63% of people who are actively disengaged in their work imagine that being released in this type of way and the type of productivity and work that we could and impact we could be unleashing in many different contexts. So how do we get here? And we could spend a whole hour talking about the history of this machine metaphor, but it's good to have a quick reference to it before we talk about this definition of life or what living systems really are. And it's good to remember that this model or this understanding of our world or the universe really you could trace back to the Age of Enlightenment. And it was an empowering idea at the time. That it was a move away from the idea of hierarchical monarchies and fate and faith and institutionalized religion. Some of the seminal writers across many different disciplines, Descartes, Copernicus, Galileo, Locke, Jefferson, Voltaire, and Newton, all of their thinking came out of this time. And all of their thinking and all of their writing came together in this idea that the world is not just fated or designed by an external force, but it is somehow predictable, that we can observe patterns, we can measure patterns, and it's predictable. And that arose into this idea that the universe works like a giant machine or a giant clock, and was referred to as the clockwork universe. And this ability to observe and predict through reduction and reason is actually, it's good to remember, this is deeply connected to individual empowerment. That knowing cause and effect disrupts this idea of just divine fate or divine rights. And this really forms the philosophical foundation for democracy, human rights, and social justice in much of our modern civilization that we take for granted. And in some ways, we can link this back to Newton's laws being so good, him being such a great observer and a great scientist, and his work being so convincing and so specific, and worked so well for the physical laws of the universe, that really we spent the next 300 years trying to apply this scientific, reductionist, and mechanistic approach to many different aspects and many different human endeavors. Unfortunately, they work really well for physical forces, but they don't work so well for more complex systems. And so some of our most famous scientists, including Einstein himself, reflected that when a number of factors coming into play in some phenomenological complex is too large, this scientific method in most cases breaks down. One only needs to think of the weather, in which case prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible. And the great systems thinker Donella Meadows reflected that the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, and psychological economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent and intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. And it's important here then to think about what kind of problems are we addressing, and the difference between a simple problem and, more importantly, the difference between a complicated problem and a complex problem. All the details in this figure aren't so important, except to understand this idea that there's not so much difference between a simple problem and a complicated problem. It's just that complicated has more parts to it. So a simple problem is like baking a cake. A recipe is essential, but if you follow the recipe, you get to a fairly predictable outcome. And a complicated problem, like building a rocket and sending it to the moon, on one hand, of course, is an order of magnitude different than baking a cake, but in some ways is actually more connected to baking a cake than raising a child. And the reason why it's more connected is that, yes, there are more pieces and there's a lot more math involved and a lot more details, but it's still a set of predictable steps that lead to a set of fairly predictable outcomes. Versus raising a child is an example of a complex problem. All of us, any of us with children, I don't have children myself, but I think I can connect to it, is that if there was a recipe for raising a healthy, well-adjusted, self-actualized child, we would all follow it. But we all know that that's not the case. There are so many different factors involved. There are so many unknowns that it's not the type of problem that we can just have a recipe for or a set of predictable outcomes. Another way to think about this is simple and complicated problems involve things that we can make. Even if they're extremely complicated things like a rocket or a computer or a cell phone, versus complex problems are inherently problems that we have to manage. They are complex systems. And this recognition, it's exciting how this is being recognized across so many different disciplines today. And many of you are involved in efforts working on this. This is just a few examples in the last years of recognizing schools as complex systems, healthcare organizations as complex adaptive systems. And so I personally believe that we're in the middle of another shift in perception similar to the Age of Enlightenment. And I don't think we will look back at this time as the digital age or the Facebook age or the millennial age. I believe we'll look back on this time as the age that we either understood or will not be here. We will have failed to understand how to manage complex systems. But we will really look back this to be the age of complexity. And so recognizing this, we need a different metaphor, a different way of modeling our systems that help to manage complex systems. And this is why we are thinking and looking to at a rhythm to living systems as a new metaphor. But it's important to be really clear then what we mean by life and what we mean by living systems, because there are many different metaphors for life out there, and some are more accurate and some are less accurate. Here's one current metaphor for life, which is this Disney idea of a circle of life. I'm very excited personally for the live action Lion King that's coming out this next couple of months in America. But their view of nature is this idea of this perfect circle and perfect balance where everything fits together sort of voluntarily. And this is an incomplete metaphor at best, because really what it's pointing to is this idea that that nature works in cycles. It's not a perfect circle where things are voluntarily sacrificing themselves for the good of others, but this is based on this idea of predator and prey relationships going up and down. And when there's too much prey, that predator populations move up. And when predator populations move up, prey populations move down. And that it's in this dynamic balance. And in fact, we forget the fact that this is an aspect of predator and prey relationships, of this dynamic balance. This doesn't lend itself too well to a Disney movie, although maybe the new version will have something pointing towards this. And this is being recognized, and I think it's always good to look at humor in society as a recognition of sort of future signals. This is actually a New Zealand product. New Zealand's artist who's creating these toys that he's calling adorable circle of life toys, and they all, in this case, it's a walrus munching on a baby seal. So it's all pointing to this sort of incomplete idea of a circle of life being this harmonious metaphor for life. So what do we really mean by life then? And here it's very exciting that in recent years, probably for the first time in many ways in the discipline of biology, we actually have a very workable and usable understanding of what life is. Because actually up to this point, it's been very hard, and biologists have not been able to actually think about or design or really have a strong definition of life. So you can copy this slide and have a chance to do this on your own. I just introduce it as an exercise. We won't have time to do it together. But actually, the exercise here points to this, that if you take this list of objects and you try to define, put it into two lists. One are things you think of as living and some things that you think of as not living. So say a baby and a tree and a fly, most people agree is living, and a robot or the moon, you may decide is not living. Doesn't matter what your criteria, it doesn't matter what your lists are. The next step is the most important, is to try to create a set of criteria that is true for both set of lists, right? So an example is if you said a rock is non-living and a fly is living, the criteria that would be valid would be living things can move. And you have to find a set of criteria that apply for everything in your list of living and everything in your list of non-living. And sort of spoiler alert, I'll let you do it on your own. It's still very interesting to do, but actually it's extremely hard to come up with a set of criteria that are in fact applicable to all things in this list. And biologists have tried to come up with different definitions of life. And here are some of the different aspects: growth and development, the ability to reproduce, the ability to respond to the environment, metabolism, homeostasis, heredity. And actually, none of these in and of themselves are an adequate definition. So it's only till very recently that a set of scientists took actually a systems or holistic view of tackling this problem. And this we will refer to a lot of Humberto Materna's and Francisco Varela's work. There are two biologists from Chile, Santiago, Chile. And so this is often referred to as the Santiago School, or Santiago idea of the conception of life or the definition of life. And we are taking a lot of this information from this wonderful summarized book about all of what we're presenting today by Fritjof Capra and Per Luigi Luisa, called The Systems View of Life, and I highly recommend it. And so what the Santiago School did was they took a very basic form of life, an E. coli bacteria, and they examined and mapped every single chemical, material, and energetic pathway they could. And since it's a simple life form, they could do this. And what they found is they could recreate each of these pathways outside of the cell. And they could keep it in sort of this artificial stasis for a while, but it would not function as a living cell outside in a test tube. And what they found was that actually inside the cell wall, inside of an E. coli, that the E. coli had everything it needed to maintain all of these pathways, and it had the ability to repair itself within this cell wall. And so they realized that this is actually the defining aspect of life, that you can recreate chemical pathways outside of a cell in a test tube, and it will not have this ability to maintain itself or repair itself. And so they coined this very beautiful term that they called autopoiesis, meaning self-poetry or self-making. So the defining aspect of life is that it has the ability to repair itself. And so their definition of life is that life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And so for us at Rhythm, focusing on building regenerative organizations, regenerative communities, regenerative economies or systems, then actually a living system is really our only model we can look to, because living systems, in fact, are synonymous with regenerative ability, and regenerative is actually unique to living systems. The next very interesting question that the Santiago School asked was, well, where is this ability to self-maintain located? Where is life actually located within the cell? Is it controlled by the nucleus? Is it controlled by certain aspects of the cell? And they found that it's actually the self-regenerative ability is not located in any one place. That is in fact dependent on all the interconnected relationships of all parts of the cell. That life itself is a holistic or an emergent property of all the parts of the cell and the relationships between the parts of the cell. And really interestingly, each part in and of itself is also a self-regenerative system or autopoietic system, so that we see consistently in nature whole systems being within other whole systems or wholes within wholes. And so we can think of this then as an understanding of what life is. If we look to our own body, then we understand that we have all of these different organs like lungs and the stomach and the brain and the heart, but life isn't located in any one aspect of those organs. For a human body to be alive, it is all the interconnections between all of these organs that's needed to, in fact, be able to continue to live. And so the very interesting question when we apply this then to organizations is this idea of a boundary of our own making. So if we look at the cell as Santiago School did, then the element of regeneration is biophysical. It's proteins and lipids and and chemicals being recreated by the cell to create that cell wall. So what is it for an organization then? And there's one great researcher named Niklas Luhmann who has posed this question and researched this question of what is autopoiesis or regeneration from a human organization perspective, and has very convincingly made the argument that it is our patterns of communication with each other that defines an organization. In a sense, in a very grounded way, we say, what is it that we say is inside and us, or inside the organization versus outside? And we can do this with any organization. Who is part of our family and who is not? Who is part of our company, who is not? And what Luhmann found that it is actually, this boundary is not just the genetic patterns or definitions or relationships, but it is the common culture and norms and agreements that we have formed with each other to call this an organization versus something outside of that organization. So the very interesting question then within this is, well, if we know what life is, then what is death? And this is still being researched, but we do know that it sounds sort of circular, but death is the lack of life. Sort of self-determining there, but more specifically, it's somehow the ending of this ability to be self-regenerative, and why that ability ends is not completely known from a biological perspective. But we do know that it involves the breaking of all of these interconnected relationships between these different parts. And so if we go back to this understanding of life being the interconnection between all of our different organs, then death is, on the right here, the lack of those connections. And we know from modern medicine, we can actually keep most of these organs functioning outside of, with some sort of external input, but that is not in fact a living system. It does not have the ability to continue to live and maintain itself. It's pretty easy to imagine applying this to each of our businesses or organizations then, where we can think of the different departments as like organs in a body, and all the interconnections then being what is deeply important for that organization to be living. Versus the figure on the right here is probably, unfortunately, we've all probably had experience working in an organization like this, where each of the different departments of an organization are working on their own and siloed and continuing to function for some period of time. But the long-term health, long-term ability of that organization to thrive is really challenged. And in a sense, it's already dead, or it's at least dying as an organization. The other question then the Santiago School asked is, well, what's the relationship between this living organism as defined within the cell wall and its environment, or what is outside the cell wall? And what they found was there actually really is, this is sort of a false categorization. There really is no environment in some independent or abstract sense. Just as there's no organism without an environment, there's no environment without an organism. Importantly is that organisms don't just experience environments passively, they also actively create them. And the best example of this is actually to take the whole Earth itself. So a really brilliant and seminal researcher named James Lovelock, who was an atmospheric chemist, took a look at the atmospheric composition of Earth compared to Venus and Mars, and recognized that it is not this Goldilocks model of Earth being exactly the right distance from the sun, but in fact, without life on it, Earth's atmospheric composition would look almost identical to Venus and Mars. What keeps our atmospheric composition, particularly the 21% oxygen in our atmosphere, is life itself. And he posed this idea that the Earth as a whole actually acts like as its own self-regenerative, self-maintaining autopoietic system, or life itself, the Earth itself is a living system, and it is life creating the conditions necessary for life to continue to exist. And so the Santiago School defined this then as, or described this as, life is constantly making or creating a dynamic balance between what they called self-assertive versus integrative behaviors, where self-assertive are all of the pathways and behaviors and self-regenerative capabilities that happen inside the cell wall, versus the environment is all the inputs and outputs that happen between this living system and the quote unquote environment, but they're really connected. One is affecting the other in a constant dynamic balance. And we see some pretty interesting examples of what this balance looks like. Here are just two examples, one a human example and one an animal example, where if anyone watches the Tour de France or is a professional cyclist, knows that this form called the peloton emerges, which is a constant balance between individual competition and integrative cooperation needed to be able to finish the race. If a single cyclist goes out on its own from the beginning, there's no way that they can win. And this is actually the exact same thing that's happening with migrating geese. They're more interrelated, they're often family groups, but they are taking turns, they are competing with one another, they are balancing both integrative and self-assertive behaviors in creating this formation. And so what does that look like in terms of our human organizations and human behaviors? Again, this is a framework that Capra and Louisa put together, where they classified different human behaviors into these broad categories of thinking and values, and then listed some of examples of self-assertive thinking and integrative thinking, and self-assertive values and integrative values. And the importance here is that in this concept, there is no inherent moral, objectively better behavior or worse behavior. It's not that self-assertive behaviors or thinking and values are wrong in some ways, but it's the recognition that we're to create thriving regenerative living systems, that a balance of self-assertive versus and integrative is needed. And certainly if we look at what's listed on the left of each of these lists, our current model for how we run organizations, particularly corporate for-profit organizations, is an imbalance of the self-assertive thinking and values, where we stress competition over cooperation. We stress reductionism and quantitative prediction over quality, linear patterns and domination over nonlinear patterns and partnership. And so we often look to this in rhythm and say, how do we bring in more of the integrative thinking and values into how we run our organizations? So just to summarize this piece of the webinar, and then we'll move into In Rhythm's framework for running and operating and designing organizations. For us, life is more than a metaphor. That regenerative, this ability to be regenerative, is a unique and defining property of life. And there are four main components to this definition of life. One is that life is an organized system capable of self-regeneration within a boundary of its own making, whether that be a biophysical boundary in the case of a cell, or a cultural or informational boundary, communication boundary in terms of an organization. That the components of living systems are also holistic systems in themselves. There's wholes within wholes. And that this ability to be alive, this ability to regenerate, is not located in any one place, but it is in itself, in fact, an emergent property of all the interconnected relationships of all the components of a living system. And that fourth, that life is both affected by and creates its environment, and that living systems maintain a constant dynamic balance of behaviors for self-assertive and integrative functions. And so here's our living, evolving, and definition of a regenerative organization then. And this is a definition itself that's changing over time, but our current way we are describing a living regenerative organization is a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And it's the second part of this that we find is particularly useful from a design perspective, where we put a particular focus on how do we create underlying health, and how do we monitor and understand the underlying health of the system in order to allow abundance and resilience to be emergent outcomes, the same way that life itself is an emergent outcome in a living system. And so we at Rhythm talk a lot about designing to principles. We do not provide prescriptive or recipes for creating regenerative organization, but instead we look at these properties of living systems and design to them and help facilitate other organizations to think about what each of these principles mean in their context, in their organization, in their communities. And so these are not a totality of principles, but ones that we found very useful to focus on. And again, the idea of holism, that everything is interrelated and interdependent; mutualism, that everything, life itself is dependent on the interdependence of all of these relationships; uniqueness, evolutionary; nodal, meaning that life is not located in any one place, that the ability to be alive is in fact decentralized and distributed across the whole system; and developmental, which is a commitment to the growth and health of each member or each part of that system. And so this is our regenerative framework. This is the framework we use to design living organizations, design regenerative organizations in many different contexts, from for-profits to nonprofits to communities in South Africa to networks of communities working on urban issues. We have found this to be an extremely flexible, extremely powerful framework to help groups of people design to create the impact or the value that they're wanting to create together. And we'll just introduce this very briefly today. If you're further interested in learning more about this, we have a whole month-long online course where we dig deeply into each aspect of this framework. But here, the aspects to really think about is this focus here in the middle on structures. Or the best way to think about it is, most of the time when we have an issue in an organization, our first reaction is to change this column here. We need new work, we need a new strategic plan, we need a new product or program, we need new technology and tools, or we need to get some short-term outcomes to be able to boost ourselves into that next phase of work. And as again, like a soil, like an agriculture system, that would be like if our crop is failing, simply to change the crop and not look at the underlying health of the soil. So we turn that around and we say, well, what is the underlying organizational health then? Because without understanding that, without nurturing that, we can't create any meaningful work on top of that. So, and health itself is dependent on really understanding the shared context, or the shared values, the shared purpose, the shared behaviors and supportive environment that define our organization. And we understand health to be made up of four main systems or flows. The one first being energy flow, meaning all organizations are dependent on thriving people. That is the energy that carries work through the organization. That those people need to be informed and be able to make intelligent decisions, which is captured here in the information cycle. And that information needs to be exchanged and relevant to all aspects of the system through a nodal and distributed structure, and that all organizations need to have a diverse and supportive community in order to thrive. We spend a lot of time then working with organizations and networks to say, well, what are the structures then that both enable and ensure organizational health, as well as be a platform for creating the organizational work. And all of that culminates then in organizational abundance and resilience. Again, where unlimited potential, resilience, value, impact, and wealth creation then are a recurring outcome and of underlying health of all other aspects of this framework. Well, great. Let me just talk about some of the other ways we can support you, or other offerings that we have. And I forgot to mention the online course. So one that's not on this slide is we do have a 4-week online course that meets once a week, and that's coming up in July. I'll let Alex speak to that at the end. We are also offering, if you follow up from this, you just have some more questions. We understand this is a very brief introduction. So we're offering just some 30-minute group coffee chats. And if you're interested in that, contact Alex as well. I mentioned our organizational health index. This is a specific tool that we can help implement in your organization or your network. And please contact us. And as I mentioned to one of the questions, we often start our work in a pretty traditional business support way, but it's within this regenerative framework. So we may help with strategic planning or a hiring strategy or HR approach, operational support, or financial modeling. And as well, of course, we can design specific long-term or short-term custom engagements with your organization.
So just to add to that, the online course, so we have one coming up in July. It'll take place starting the second week of July on Thursdays, and it really serves as an introduction to the foundations of the framework. It'll run for 4 weeks, so I could actually send you guys a link to that in the follow-up with, we'll be following up with a recording, a survey, because we'd love your feedback on how this webinar went for you. And I'll also include a link to the online course if you're interested. Yeah, and so we do have one more announcement. Great. So we've teamed up with an organization called At the Epicenter. They're hosting a summit at the end of this year. The dates should be up there on the screen, October 29th to 30th in Boulder. And so this is a unique meeting of global leaders from business, agriculture, academia, and civic sectors who recognize that we have the capacity to influence and accelerate systemic change in land to market systems that in a way that will benefit people and planet. So we just wanted to put this out there for those of you who are really interested, particularly from the food, fashion, and beauty industries, to collaborate across sectors in developing different strategies to tackle some of the challenges we're facing in those spaces. So check it out. It's on our Facebook page under events. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions. And thank you all for your time today. It's been a pleasure. Looking forward to keeping in touch. And thank you, Jeff.
And thank you everyone for your time, and look forward to connecting again soon.